There we go, and it's live. And I can hear an echo somewhere. So welcome to Thinking Without the Box, kind of a new series I'm starting to kind of hit topics that I've been wanting to visit, but haven't. They're kind of things that require everybody kind of getting on board and getting a little bit of knowledge to talk about if we're going to discuss it as layman and not sound completely pathetic and wrong. But we'll still make our best effort to be pathetic and wrong. But fortunately, we have a bit of a pro with us here today to help guide the discussion. Today we're Vito, settle down. Today we're going to be discussing descriptions and sense and reference and in the context of Frege, but I had talked about potentially talking a little bit about Meinong or Russell. I don't know how far along we'll get or how off the rails we'll get or where this is going to go. I mainly wanted to have informed discussion with friends and make that available to people in the community to kind of wrap their heads around some things they might not normally get exposure to during the kind of normal course of things. With that as the kind of table setter, I'd be curious if Alex could give us some sense of context here, some sense of context.
Okay, so context for Frege's theory of sense and reference.
Mm-hmm, sure, yeah.
Okay, so Frege's this sort of mathematician, logician, philosopher guy who's working around kind of the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, dies in like 1921 or something. And he's doing most of his really important work that we're going to be thinking about today around 1890 to 1900, that kind of period. And what he's doing, so this work that he does, it kind of inaugurates this new period of philosophy. It's kind of like the beginning of what we now call analytic philosophy, which is kind of all the rage today in English-speaking predominantly, but also across Europe as well, philosophy departments. And it's characterized by a kind of use of formal logic for precisely like analyzing and breaking down concepts and saying things very, very clearly and showing logical relations between things. And the reason that Frege marks kind of the inaugural period of this part of philosophy is because he makes some achievements, he makes some breakthroughs in logic. Now these are important to understand what's going on with his distinction between sense and reference, which we'll get onto in a minute. But I suppose primarily he's kind of like a mathematician, and the mathematical community had been wrestling with certain problems around this period, which forced them to investigate the foundations of mathematics. So one way to think about this is that in the development of mathematics versus the development of logic, starting with around sort of 1600, mathematics kicks off with Leibniz and Newton doing the calculus, and there's all sorts of other developments in algebra and real analysis and stuff that's going on. So mathematics is becoming very, very sophisticated, but not really anything is happening in logic. At the same period, we get this thing called the Port Royal logic, which is sort of satirized as a kind of like a low period. It's where we get the term modus ponens from, but there's almost no other logical developments going on at this time at all. It's like really barren and boring. But without going into too much of the detail of the mathematics, the idea of proving something was one of the areas that was like not up to the standards of the rest of mathematics. So in order to show conclusively that you'd established a result, often the mathematicians would rely on it's like where everything got quite hand-wavy, and you say, well, it's obvious that this bit follows from that bit, and blah, blah, blah. They just phrase it in words or something like this. But because there were challenges to the basis of mathematics, like people had kind of the traditional Greek idea is that there's some kind of dependency from mathematics to geometry. Like geometry is the really sound thing. It might just be because there's a Euclidean system of geometry is more established, but it might be that there's a kind of philosophical kind of reduction there going on. And then with the development of non-Euclidean geometries is one thing, or the transfinite arithmetic is another. The basic building blocks of mathematics seem to be kind of called into question. And so there's two kind of distinct projects that are going on. Sorry, my dog is going absolutely mental for some reason. Yes, there's two distinct things going on. It's trying to find a firm foundation for logic, for mathematics, and develop the notion of proof so that it's perfectly systematic and rigid, or rigorous rather. Frege is trying to set himself this task, and his big idea is that you should be able to, or indeed proposes that you can, reduce mathematical notions to logical notions. So he gives, I get it might be key to talk about the definition in particular later on, but he gives a kind of definition of numbers in logical terms. So you can express that there is exactly one of something without using numbers. So it's key because when you're trying to give a definition of, say, numbers, you want on the one hand say number one, and then on the other hand, the equal sign, you want to define it in terms that don't presuppose number already, or else you're not really like giving a reduction. So it's quite hard to do that. And Frege gives this kind of plausible-looking logical reduction for basic natural numbers. So this project is called logicism. In order to spell this reduction out in detail, he basically takes a look at the logical machinery that's available at the time and decides that it's not up to scratch, and sort of goes about rethinking basic elements of logic and the syntax and the structure in order to be able to say clearly the various notions that he needs to do to enact his logicist program clearly. So, for instance, one of the things he needs to be able to say precisely in logical terms is, for instance, that say if you've got two sets, you want to be able to say something like if you can put them into a one-to-one relation with one another, then they have the same number of things in them. And in order to say that very clearly in a logical notation, he needs to kind of tie up all these loose ends. And it's kind of like he's pulling at a thread because it shouldn't be too difficult. I just tinker with it a little bit. And it turns out, no, you have to kind of go demolish the foundations and build right back up from the beginning again.
I assume that when he was doing this and fleshing out these relationships and these trying to figure out, A equals A, but A equals B. In what sense does A equal B? And as he's working this out, it seems like like you said, it's like pulling at a thread, and this whole thing balloons out into this kind of undiscovered area that I'm sure was intimidating at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, he went almost unnoticed in his day. Most of the kind of mathematicians of his day just didn't pay any attention to or weren't interested in what he was doing. So he's kind of this like sorry figure in a sense, because nowadays everybody rates him. He's kind of like one of these bands from the old days that no one listened to at the time, and then all these subsequent bands say, oh yeah, we were all listening to these guys, and that's like influences a generation of people everyone listens to or something. He's like that. He's kind of like the hipster logician. So he was doing it before everyone else was doing it.
Did it for him personally, did it stop becoming about the math and become about the language, or did it continue to be about getting logic into language?
And that's a question that there's still quite a lot of debate about, and so I think so. This one of the main kind of Frege interpreters, a guy called Michael Dummett, and I believe his line is that Frege's analysis of these distinctions we haven't really come onto yet, but it spills out from constructing a language suitable for this project in mathematics and proof theory, but it has general lessons that are applicable to language, more widely. It's not just relegated to this kind of artificial level. But then you get other people that don't think that. So it's not entirely like it's kind of an exegetical question as to whether it's supposed to apply across the board, whether it's just supposed to apply to an artificial language, or a kind of middle ground where it applies to natural language to the extent that natural language, like a part of natural language, can be kind of modeled formally. So I guess if you think about the applicability of a physical theory, like Newton's theory of gravity or something, I mean, on the widest sort of scale, it doesn't apply. We know it doesn't quite apply to everything because of relativity or whatever. Right? There's situations where Newton's equations aren't quite right. However, there is still a kind of quite a lot of reality that it does apply to perfectly well. So you can kind of abstract away from the bits that it doesn't apply to and apply Newtonian theory correctly. And it's going to give you the right answer, provided you're restricting its application. And you could see these kind of abstract insights about the way that language functions from Frege as not failing because they don't apply to absolutely all of language, but still succeeding in that they describe a sort of core part of language perfectly adequately. And you might argue that it's kind of a foundational aspect to language. So I don't know. It's very complicated to see exactly what the relationship is between these two things.
And so, were there others around that? I got the sense that there were others around that time prior to, say, before you get into Russell and whatnot. Just before the turn of the century, some logicians were looking at this, or some mathematicians were starting to look at this as well. Or was he pretty much on his own there?
Okay, so there are people doing closely related things, but there's I believe that Frege is more or less operating on his own in particular for what he's doing. And so, okay, so there's people who, so for instance, it's not like he's the first person that thought, oh, well, logic needs to be brought up to modern standards or something. And George Boole enacted a similar sort of idea about 50 years beforehand, where he proposed, algebraicizing, which is a long word that just basically means using the kind of sophistication of algebra to logic, which up until that point wasn't done in a kind of particularly symbolic manner. So he was saying, look, we've got this logic stuff sketched out. It's kind of like a formal theory like we've got in algebra, but the precise rules at the bottom of this aren't clearly known yet. Mm-hmm. We've got a general idea about them, but we couldn't say anything like we could do with the rigor of the mathematical theory. So he applied mathematical methods, but only got limited results. Part of the okay, so he does achieve some kind of notable insights, but part of what's hamstringing him is that he's still sticking to an Aristotelian model. And really, what we're left with, the story of logic is kind of like there's this really big party at the beginning, and it's such a good party that everyone, like the whole history of logic, is left with this massive hangover that doesn't really clear for 2,000 years until Boole, and Boole's in this period where they're kind of like waking up a bit, drinking water, starting to feel better, ready to like start thinking properly again. And Frege is one of the people who really is fully back on top of things now. We're not hamstrung. We're start again, but clear away the misunderstandings, and there's real progress there, really, for the first time.
And did you say that analytic philosophy was born out of this?
Yeah, basically, that's right. I mean, well, so analytic philosophy is this is another kind of contentious area, but more or less it kind of traces its roots back to the work of Russell, Wittgenstein, and G.E. Moore, and all three of those guys, or Russell and Wittgenstein in particular, were massively indebted to the developments that Frege made. So, yeah, they say stuff that Frege doesn't, which is what really characterizes analytic philosophy. But they wouldn't be saying any of that stuff if it wasn't for Frege. And Frege's like this very, very original and innovative logician that makes all the difference. So anyway, yes, you asked me to say something about the context, so hopefully that's...
Yeah. So maybe we can start digging. Maybe we can start digging into Frege's kind of language for how he talks about this. This stuff all deals with ontologies and concepts and objects. He has another paper called Concept and Object. I think it's or Object and Concept. And then there's the Sense and Reference paper that was kind of the inspiration for this. I ended up in this discussion or in this topic when I was making a response video to Trey Jadlow's issues with nothing, and wanting, as I dug in and started going, okay, how do I want to articulate this? Then stumbled over this wonderful period, and especially Frege kind of getting into talking about modes of presentation and senses that we have references with that we try to refer to things in the world, and there are different senses in which that describe the referent or fill in the referent or denote or signify the referent or describe, I guess, the referent. So maybe we could try to get into that a little bit. I don't want to butcher it too bad because I'm already feeling like I stumble through his different distinctions, and then I also get crossover with Russell's notions, which are slightly different.
Okay.
In particular, maybe talk about sense and reference to start. Yeah.
Yeah. So okay. So I mean, I don't know my mind can only begin to imagine what it was you were trying to clear up with Trey. So I won't try and like.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. We could set that aside. But it was mainly that when we're talking about no things, right?
Yeah.
We were talking and getting into trying to help him understand, or help anybody else who's willing to watch that video understand what the difference is between concept and the object, and when we refer to things, when we're talking about things, what is it we're referring to, and get into quantities as well, right? Or existence statements. That there's Russell got into I think I even talked about in that video the bald king of France, right?
Yeah. Okay, so what we're talking about here is what's referred to as negative existentials. So
but we don't have to talk about that aspect right now. We should probably just start with sense and reference to begin, I think.
So what? Yeah, or maybe start with the proper name. Maybe start with the proper names or singular term kind of problems. So we get into identity, then LEM, and then finally getting into the existentials, maybe non-existent things.
And
right?
Also, can you simply state what sense and reference is? Is there?
Yeah, I think we could probably start with that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So there are two kind of aspects that are involved in like this. Kind of like linguistic elements of a phrase, something like that. It's kind of way of thinking about it. So let's see. So the reference of a term is the thing that it stands for. So a term would be a bit of a logical argument, like a constant, say, for instance. So if you're doing algebra in maths, you might use a letter like A or something. And what that refers to, it might be that you say, let A be 1 or something. Right? So whenever you see A appearing in the bit of algebra, it refers to the number 1. You just know that that's what that is. Right?
It's like the signifier, right? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
The label that you're using to attach to the thing?
To point to it.
Yeah, to point to the variable, whatever it is.
Yeah, like a name, say, for instance. So Alex refers to me, right? But then there are, so I mean, Frege's point is that there's more to the certain phrases, like, say, for instance, the morning star, right? That seems to refer to this thing up in the sky, just in the same sort of way. So sort of semantically, you might think its function is exactly the same as the way that the name Alex refers to me. But then it turns out that the evening star, which it turns out refers to the same thing, if all that its meaning was, if all of its function in a sentence that it was in, all of it contributed to that sentence was just pointing to the evening star, then you should be able to substitute one for the other in a sentence, and it won't make any difference because it will still refer to the same thing, right? Like if I was also known as Jim, for instance, for some reason I'm known as Alex, I'm also known as Jim, say, and if Alex has got a beard and Jim's got a beard, it's going to be true as well, because Alex and Jim are the same thing. That all it does is it points to me each time, so it doesn't matter which one you use, you can substitute them and it doesn't make any difference to the sentence. Well, with certain terms like the morning star and the evening star, you might know that, well, it might be true that the morning star is the evening star, right? So that those two things are identical, but that the morning star is the morning star. It kind of has a different property to it, right? For instance, you kind of intuitively know that the morning star is the morning star, right? I mean, that's just because everything is identical to itself, right? So if I have any name and an equal sign and then the same name again on the other side of the equal sign, obviously that's true. Everything's identical to itself. So you know that because it's obvious, right? if it comes to the morning star equals the evening star, well, that's not obvious, and we actually had to discover it kind of empirically. It was discovery that people made, using telescopes or whatever. They figured out that it's like Venus or something, and there you go. So there's something that you've got to explain about how those two sentences can be different to one another, in the sense that someone could know one of them and not know the other one, even though they seem to mean exactly the same thing if all that there was reference. So it seems like there's something else that's going on here, which is what Frege calls the sense. So not only does a referring term like this point to a thing in the world, but it also points to it in a certain way. And it's the way that it points to it, which is what Frege is talking about as the sense. So he has an example which is like, if you picture a triangle, and that picture, right, so say this is the triangle, right, and then imagine it's got like a line coming down through the top point that intersects the middle of this bottom line. And then it's the same 3 lines coming out of each point, right? So each line intersects the middle of its opposing plane, or opposing side. Well, they obviously all cross over in the middle at exactly the same point. And you could think about the intersection of line A and B and the intersection of line A and C. Well, it's the same point each time, but it's just presenting you the same point in a different way by saying, well, it's the intersection of these two lines, or it's the intersection of these two lines. So he's saying that's a way of thinking about the sense of the phrase, or of the phrase when you're referring to that point. So two different phrases can refer to the same thing but have different senses. So this is his kind of big distinction that goes on in that paper, Sense and Reference.
Yeah, there was a good example that Kane B used.
I was just going to bring that up. The thing with Bob Dylan.
Yeah, Bob Dylan. I don't remember his I can't remember his real name.
I do. It's Robert Zimmerman.
Right. Yes, Robert Zimmerman. So he brought up that Robert Zimmerman. So Bob Dylan's a famous singer, but Robert Zimmerman is not a famous singer. But Robert Zimmerman and Bob Dylan equals Bob Dylan, right? So they're the same person, but in different. They have different senses about them.
Right. So the point is, as far as I can tell, is that if in fact it was just reference, then these two sentences would both be equally trivial, right? Robert Zimmerman is Robert Zimmerman, and Robert Zimmerman is Bob Dylan. Yeah. But in fact, it's only the first one I said that seems trivial. There's something going on with the second one that actually is meaningful, and I think that's what the point is that it can't just be reference, because otherwise those two would have exactly the same trivial meaning to us, and they don't.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's also really interesting. This is along those same lines, but probably more basic than that. I hadn't really thought of it before. Of the when you utter a tautology like Robert Zimmerman is Robert Zimmerman, it's trivial, right? There's nothing filled in there, right? But when you say or even when you don't do something that is equal, when I say I could say this beer can is beer can, but there's nothing actually substantive there. But this beer can is round. The round pit. Somebody described it as the round bit basically fitting into the referent, right? That if you that there's a hole there, that there's something to be filled in it when you're describing something. There was an aspect to that was really interesting to me in terms of that there's no content gained by the holes, I guess is what I'm saying. So really poorly.
Yeah, they become somebody saved me. True kind of things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was just interesting that you couldn't say that Jane is the Bert or something like that. Like that there's a notion to describing something that you're essentially filling in the holes, or there's a space to be occupied by those statements. Was kind of interesting to me. And in the same way, I guess with Robert Zimmerman is Bob Dylan, there's a sense to Robert Zimmerman that isn't Bob Dylan and vice versa, right?
Yeah, with names are. This is easier to see when you're looking at something like. So Mill's example is that there's this town in the UK called Dartmouth. Right? It's the mouth of the River Dart, That's why it's got its name, Dartmouth. And he's saying, like, that it's, in a sense, the way that it's got its name is because it's something to do with the property of the town. That's why it was given that name. So, but if the River Dart changed its course, you could still talk about Dartmouth the same way. Well, so Mill is kind of an enemy to Frege because he thinks that this sense thing, kind of connotation in Mill's terms, is almost irrelevant for logical thinking. It doesn't really matter that much. Connotation is a way of getting you to the reference, but the reference is all that's required. Whereas with Frege, the sense kind of plays a crucial role for him in. So I mean, it seems to me that it's crucial really to think about negative existentials at this point, because this is part of what is driving this whole change forwards. So
can I bring up one thing before we talk about that?
Yeah.
Just on that, I don't want to get too far from it, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but part of it seemed like it dealt with Frege's. I either read or I had heard or picked it up from a couple of sources. Frege had this notion of the true, right, and the false.
Yeah, as objects.
Right, and that there was. It seemed like all true things would basically converge on one, like an ontology that was true, essentially, like a or well, not that the ontology is true, but that the it had to do with it started to get me to understand a little bit why he had that notion of which I think was somebody else's articulation of the wholes versus the parts that fill the holes, essentially, was that when you're referring that the things become they become true of I don't. Alex, do you know at all what I'm talking about? You might be able to put it better than I am.
Yeah. So the idea is that with propositions that are true, so the proposition refers to its reference. A true proposition, its reference is the true. False proposition, its reference is the false. So we need to distinguish between. So it's kind of like the reference of a whole fully formed proposition and the reference of like the parts in a proposition. So what we were talking about before was a much more fine-grained look at things. So we're looking at the referent of a name, say, or the referent of a phrase like the morning star. Obviously, a name or a phrase like that isn't going to be true or false. It's only once you reach the level of like completed sentences or propositions that they start having reference going straight to the true or straight to the false. So when we're talking about the sense reference distinction, I think is really more solving problems down at the level of like names and so parts of sentences, like why they point to the true rather than to the false.
Yeah, if you were to put it in the whole thing, it would be like the proposition would be that Venus is the morning star, would have a truth value to it.
Yeah, that's right. Right, definitely.
Right, but all of it, he saw it as being that it seemed like there was a bigger understanding of all things pointing at one ontology, essentially, and that's where shoot, I can't get it in my head. I had it like a week ago, and I was thinking about this, and you reminded me of it. But it seemed like it was basically like two sets of categories, essentially, between the true and the false, and it seemed far more Platonic than almost like forms and whatnot. But it seemed like it was more along that lines than like Russell, which seemed like he rejected all of that. And it wasn't that Frege was talking that way, but it seemed like it was suggesting that there were basically these two categories, and that would then become your ontology, but that would somehow apprehend what is what is the case. But anyway.
What's interesting to me is that the way you're describing Frege seems opposite to my conception, right? So, like, for example, if we look at the law of excluded middle, right? I would think that Frege would be, I don't know, softer on it. Like, he would say that propositions that involve, these two parts and one of the parts doesn't exist or something like that, you could say of that whole proposition that it's neither true nor false because of this piece, right? That isn't the whole proposition itself can be said to be neither true nor false. But Russell didn't like that.
He would say
right?
they're both true, though, right? Like I know he had an issue with the.
He would say it's false because of the piece that is false. So it's a scope thing, right? Whereas, right? So that's when we talk about these non-existent things, right? Like the present king of France is bald. So Frege would say that's neither true nor false. But Russell would say, it's false. And it's false because of this piece about the existence of the present king of France. Right? And so that piece, the present king of France, so Russell is saying the whole thing is false because of this piece of it. And Frege is saying, look at the whole thing. You can't say if it's true or false.
Right.
No, that's not right. Frege says that the law of excluded middle applies to the phrase the present king of France is bald. Right. Either the present king of France is bald or it's not the case the present king of France is bald. He thinks one of those is true and the other's false.
Yeah, and he's presenting it as one is malformed kind of thing.
Well, no. So Frege's idea with negative existential. So these are terms that don't seem to pick anything out. He has this kind of strategy of saying, well, look, if a term doesn't apply to anything, then let's just arbitrarily give it some designation. So that, for instance, the empty set, right, the set of no things. But it could just as easily be anything. It doesn't matter. It's just something. Just pick a thing. And because the empty set isn't bald, right, it's true to say that it's not bald. So that's why the king of France is not bald. It's true. But one of them's true, the other one's false. Right. So it's weird for Frege. But he thinks that picking an arbitrary referent in that case is good enough to preserve law of excluded middle, for instance, and that helps him out in that situation. So his strategy with empty terms is to do that, which Russell objects to, and he's happy to. Russell's solution is kind of complicated. I mean, I'm more than happy to go into the details of it, but so I think it might. Let me just say a few things about why this is a central issue. Right? Why are we talking about phrases that don't refer to anything rather than any other aspect of language? And the reason is because it's because of the change in logic that has been brought into play by Frege. So part of the significance is that in the Aristotelian logic, the form of a basic bit of a basic proposition, a thing which can be true or false, has a very particular form, and it's something like every A is a B, something like that. Right? That's the most basic thing that can be given a truth value. And so the syllogistic logic is tracing the various combinations of these things that you can have and the valid inferences that you can draw from the invalid inferences. But it only works if you stick to those being the only type of sentences that you consider. And part of the way that another restriction that he needs to have, well, but maybe he just thinks that it is intuitive anyway, is the following. Right? So from every A is a B, you can infer there is some A which is a B. So that means that it's useful for him because it makes the system kind of manageable and it's easy to make the whole thing work properly. However, it has a consequence that means that there's no term like A which doesn't have a referent. Right? Every term that can be used in a syllogism has to refer to something. So there's, by definition, almost no negative existential involved. And part of the move from the Aristotelian logic to the modern logic was in the rejection of that inference to begin with. Wouldn't there still be
a negative on it if you were to say everything that's not a B is an A? Wouldn't that still have a negative referent to it?
Everything that's not a B is an A.
Right.
So that's not quite the same.
Okay, so don't worry about it then.
So the idea is something like you can make a syllogism which is like this. It says something like every Athenian is Greek and every Greek is European, right? And that's valid and that works. But you can't say something like every Martian is an alien, and every alien is non-human. Therefore, every Martian is non-human. The problem is that there aren't any Martians, presumably. So that doesn't count as a valid syllogism because it doesn't actually, like, those terms are ruled out of play right from the beginning because they don't have any referent to them. They're empty. And part of the reason, the sort of foundational reason for this is that Aristotle's idea, his basic idea, is that the most fundamental thing, the core of all kind of language, is ascribing a property to a thing. So you're saying, look, this pizza is burnt or whatever. I am ascribing the property of burntness to the pizza.
That's the worst piece of pizza I think I've ever seen.
It's got to be a prop.
Is that a dog toy? Is that a dog toy?
It's very cheap.
Hey,
burnt
I'm
pizza.
still missing the part where you, the other side of it, where it would be neither true nor false.
Yeah,
Well,
I think I screwed that up, right? And Alex fixed it for me.
So Frege doesn't hold that. Neither does Russell. You have to wait until you get to Strawson before. It's 1950 before someone really advocates for that solution to this particular puzzle. But so the puzzle is, on the Aristotelian view, if you say something like Pegasus doesn't exist, right? What you're doing, according to Aristotelian semantics, because that seems like it's meaningful, makes perfect sense, right? And it's true as well, because Pegasus doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
You know, leprechauns don't exist, or whatever. Pick your favorite non-existent entity and just say that it doesn't exist. Now that makes sense. But on the Aristotelian picture, what you're doing there is you're saying there's this thing, and we're ascribing it the property of not existing, basically the property of there not being a thing there. So there's this thing, but actually there isn't a thing. So if there, it's kind of self-contradictory, it cancels itself out. So, in what sense can there be a thing for you to refer to give it the property of not existing? Like every other
thing, this non-existent thing doesn't exist, pretty much.
Yeah, or you're saying this existent thing doesn't exist, and so it's almost like it's a double talk. You can't express it properly, right? So it'd be all right if you could say there's this non-existent thing and it doesn't exist. But in order to be a thing to refer to, it has to be there. It has to exist in some sense.
Okay.
So you're attributing existence to it by referring to it, but then you're saying about it that it doesn't exist.
Is that the same way as when, I noticed your conversations with Slick there? He would choose a word that would have a double meaning, and then if you picked if you tried to reply. Either way you replied, he could easily pick A or B, depending on what you picked to reply.
Right,
So
you equivocate with it, yeah.
It's like, there's no, you know what I mean? Like, there's no, if you're going to play that game, there's no win situation.
I think it may be similar in the sense that, like, the game is rigged from the start. Like, it can't work, right? Yeah, so if that's what you're saying, then yes. Yeah. But so the Aristotelian rules don't allow you to make sense almost out of this type of phrase, which it does make sense.
Well,
so
there's also the notion of you see this a lot with conversation where the word has two senses, but they're using them in the different ways based on where they are in what they're laying out in terms of the argument, right? So they do that a lot with something's true or absolute, or like there are certain terms that they can turn on with that term because they are meant in different senses based on use, but they're trying to conflate them, right?
They do it with know as well, knowledge, or like when you say you know something, they'll do that. Yeah.
Well, that's what I noticed.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. So where were we?
He was showing the pizza.
So I was just so I think the problem for me is, or well, the way I see it at least now, is that trying to account for these negative existentials, you have a problem when you're just dealing with true or false, right? Because if it's true that something that you're referring to doesn't exist, right, then it can't be about the thing that you're referring to that you're saying doesn't exist. Does that make any sense?
What's it about then?
It's usually talking about like you're usually referring to your concept doesn't exist.
Well, yeah. So like I don't know, like a fictional character or something like that, right? If you want to say that fictional character doesn't exist, right? and you want to say that that's the problem comes in when you want to say that that's true, right? Because if it's true that that fictional character doesn't exist, then what you just said can't be about the fictional character because it doesn't exist.
Right. You're trying to give it the existent property.
Right.
Yeah. Following.
So right. So whereas if you saying like that fictional character, right? If it actually is pointing to something, right? Then you're saying that in some kind of way this fictional character actually exists.
There's a good example.
Which means that the statement that you just made that the fictional character doesn't exist has to be false. So it's a true or false problem. Go ahead.
There's a good example that I heard. I think it was maybe it was Ozzy or somebody a while back gave an example of that. We found Santa Claus. She's in Florida. She's an old Jewish lady that there's a chain smoker, right? And so people say, well, no, that's not Santa. Of course, that's not Santa Claus, right? But you have notions of what an existent Santa Claus would be, what he would be, and when you don't find those things, but this thing doesn't exist, right? And so, yeah.
Well, I guess it comes down, do concepts exist in this way?
Well, that's the we're getting into the ontology of what fits into your ontology, right? I had talked about that we might talk about Meinong, but there are people, including it sounded like Russell had done this in terms of bringing a lot, like bloating their ontologies, right? And just going, yeah, these things. It's funny because you had the discussion last week about possible worlds, right? And it's what do you qualify as being real or and it's to get, it seems like this is the same issue. It's to get to a common meaning by something being true, like a common set of a criteria for truth that is consistent in its use, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I suppose it's not. I suppose I wouldn't say that the primary focus of what we're talking about now is truth as such. I mean, there's not that much analysis going into what it means. Like when Frege says, these propositions have the true as its reference. That's very mysterious, and it doesn't spend a lot of time going into that in much detail. And it's, what is the true? Right? It's just this weird object which is the true.
I meant more in terms of that something's true or not. That it's true that the King of France is bald, or that it's false. You want to have a consistent. You want to have a consistent way of a consistent set of truth makers, essentially. But I guess that's getting more into the possible world stuff you guys talked about last week. But
that is, if you go into truth theories, right? Some truth theories do hold almost a Platonic view of truth as it being a thing, and some will hold it within coherence or.
But this is where it goes confusing, where some people believe, like when you were saying, when Alex was saying, take anything, a pixie or a Bigfoot or whatever. If you're talking to somebody that thinks Bigfoot's real, doesn't that, that just it not only muddies the water, it confuses the shit out of it, because it's like.
Well, there's also a difference between actual and real, right? Like a Bigfoot being actual would be different than Bigfoot being real.
Yeah, but there are people that actually believe that there is a Bigfoot. They actually believe that. Mm-hmm. As much as you say that's impossible, there are people out there that say, no, they have 100%. They're a Bigfoot. I don't understand what you're talking about. What do you, that's where it can get really, really confusing.
Well, how do you say, I guess it'd be on this, if I had an experience where I thought I saw Bigfoot, and let's say I'm convinced now that I saw Bigfoot, and I'm talking to you.
Right.
And I tell you, Bigfoot exists.
Yeah, and I tell you it doesn't.
Would it still not make sense to say no, Bigfoot doesn't exist? If you were
to me it would. To me it would. To you it wouldn't.
Right, but to get back to Helena's point though, was that when Xbox just said Bigfoot doesn't exist, what does he mean by Bigfoot? Right, like he's referring to something that he's saying doesn't exist. but he's got a concept of it. And so what is the concept then? Is the concept aspects of other concepts or of other actualities, or
but does the Bigfoot concept, does the concept of Bigfoot exist?
Well, the concept
yes,
exists, yes. Right, but what is the concept of? Like, what are you referring to, right?
What does it point to in reality, kind of thing?
Sure. I mean, one thing that struck me when I was reading through Frege here was that he seems to equate reference with truth value, right? Or at least the idea of the referent as being part of the process of attaining the truth value of a statement. And so in that sense, I feel like, you could still make a statement like Bigfoot doesn't exist, and that still be a true statement, right? And that the referent to that is the state of affairs you're attempting to describe rather than the concept or the object that is being referred to. Because I mean, he also spends a lot of time splitting statements into parts, right, and showing that there are indexical parts and that even combinations of terms end up giving us different senses, and that can change the way that we're going to view what the referent is.
So when you say that Bigfoot doesn't exist, you're actually saying the thing you're pointing to, calling Bigfoot, doesn't exist.
I mean, and Frege does mention that there's like some sort of, he's got like a well of human conceptions, right, where we all sort of draw from. Obviously, we're all taking from a very common pool of concepts, right? And I think that's an important part of it also, that he's saying that not necessarily that the referent has to exist, but that content has to be available to almost to the person who's assessing the truth value of the statement.
Yeah, he would also say that he starts off, I think, even by saying that the concepts aren't the same between two people, right? Between two people conceiving.
He says the concepts are that, like, how does he put it? Like, the senses can be the same. They can have the same sense, but that the ideas themselves aren't going to be the same because we can't. There's no way for us to even put them in the same consciousness and compare them, right?
Well, what's interesting about that, though, is that the concepts lead in throughout the senses too, right?
Yeah.
You see this with theological non-cognitivists arguing about God, that everybody has this different concept of God, but they're all talking in the same sense.
But they're all referring to the same.
Sorry, yeah.
But we're doing
They're using
that.
different senses.
But
Right,
Frege
yes,
would say we're doing
sorry,
that all.
yeah.
Frege would say we're doing that all the time, though, right? Like
Yeah. I just thought that I didn't mean to actually go into the great debate study, but that one gets pointed out a lot. Or is easy.
I was about to say that, Alex. I really was. But you could take the same thing with God, where an atheist and a deist would both, one totally believes when you sit there as an atheist and say, no, doesn't. And I mean, it's like you're talking to that wall. You're just saying, no, there is a God, and where we ask for proof.
But do you both have the same concept?
Yeah, that's it. The concept is going to be different for them than it is. An atheist will have a different concept of God to a person who believes in God.
That's a really easy example because I think what's an interesting thing is that our concepts on things like my concept of my wife is different than my concept of the person as my wife is different than my kid's concept of the person as my wife. Like they have different things, criteria, and different experiences or perceptions that have informed their concept in a way where when they refer, the sense in which they mean, they can even be using the same words, but because of the concepts that underlie those are different between us, they wouldn't align necessarily, right? Like they're not going to be the same thing. But I can't know what their meaning is, right?
But I mean, in that case where you're referring to your wife, the way that you refer to your wife is different to the way that your kids do, or something. That's a difference between sense, I would say, and Frege idea with the whatever your wife's name is, it has a slightly different sense to you and to your kids, even though it has the same reference.
Mm-hmm. But what about like something like the Morning Star, right? Like if we were referring to the Morning Star, presumably our senses would be close enough, but would they be the same? there's
Well,
a lot.
they-
It seems like there's a lot of baggage underlying all that.
Well, they
Yeah,
both
well,
point
they
towards.
could be the
Okay.
same anyway. But
Say
I
it
mean,
again.
there's
Talk over you
another
now.
layer, which is that so your concepts for Frege are things that are shared between us. So, for instance, concept red or something. So there's one level, like I can't remember the exact terminology he employs, but I think it's something like the idea of red is the same for both of us. But the precise, say, concept, if that's the right way round between these. And of course, these are translations from the German original, so it's not always the case that they're exactly the same. But so there's this sense in which the ideas are universally shared, and they have to be, otherwise you wouldn't be able to communicate certain things to one another, like that this is red and that thing's red, and we have to be able to be referring to the same thing in order for us to be able to communicate the same idea. On the other hand, I always think about red and associate it with, I don't know, my like train set that I had when I was a kid or something. You don't, so you have a slightly different concept of red to me. But there must be, for concepts like that, universal ideas, there must be existing independently. And so I think he says it's something like when you have a thought, your thought is trying to capture something that's sort of inexpressible, but which is the ultimate thing that you're thinking about. It kind of tries to put it into words. And when we do that, and he thinks that language and thought are the same thing, so that the language is kind of the form of the thought that you're having. It tries to express this. So it's not like the actual redness itself, which is the universal that's shared between us. It's not like that's actually in the expression of my thought, but I have some kind of, like, I attach something to it, which is, my personal kind of concept of red. I don't think it's just quite murky, really. This kind of metaphysics is not necessarily relevant to the semantic issue we were talking about before, which is that there's the way that the words function. So part of the point of this kind of change in philosophy that happened around here was that people moved away from, ever since Kant, I suppose, this is a crude rendering, but ever since Kant, there's kind of been this attention on, like, describing sort of thought or something in precise detail. It's phenomenology of Hegel is kind of one way of thinking about this, and the climate that Russell and Moore and Wittgenstein established analytic philosophy in was one where everybody was an idealist, so that they believed the fundamental material of the universe was spirit, and you can see this as kind of the legacy of Kant, that it had come down to everyone sort of basically saying that the best you can do is kind of describe phenomenologically, or something like that. Anyway, it's kind of not sufficient to describe it properly. But in opposition to that, they were saying no, due to these kind of close analyses of the way that language works, it's clear that there must be we must be sort of referring to things in the world, like not just spirit, but to objects, whatever, burnt pieces of toast, bits of beer, whatever. Right? So for a fully functioning, although idealized language, it should refer to things that exist when it says true things, and never refer to things that don't exist. Or at least that's Russell's idea. At least that's Russell's middle period.
Other than like the absolute philosophical nothing, because even that one I think would refer to things that exist when you're explaining it. But is there any example of something that doesn't exist that you're not explaining through reference in the real world? I can't think of any examples. Like if I think of ghost, right? Like I refer to people and smoke and things like that. Like I always refer to something that exists.
Yeah, I don't remember who gave the example, but a square circle I think is one of those ones, right, where we try to talk about something that is incoherent or that has aspects that seem to contradict each other.
Yeah,
I would still refer to things in the real world to even get a square circle.
Well, you need to have a meaning for the sense, right? You have to know what the properties are that you're trying to refer to.
Right.
So it's kind of hard to.
Yeah, and if you were to try to say that the square circle is round, right, it would be a really difficult thing to try to get to the truth value of that statement.
It's a little like it's like something like how a bat sees the world or something with echolocation. I have no concept for what that is, and can only refer to it in the way that I map things or whatever.
Right.
But I can't give you, like, I can't draw you a picture or describe something to you that I don't have any type of
the reference to something in quote unquote reality or whatever. Like, I can't think of any example. I think I can think of people trying to make concepts that the thing that their concept is might not point to something that's actual, but it's always referred to in things that exist. Like I said, like the ghost or a unicorn, you think of a horse, so think of a horn.
But when you're saying a unicorn, okay, you have an idea of what a unicorn means. So it's a horse with a horn, whatever, can fly. I don't know, whatever. But there aren't any, right?
Right.
So you know that it's not referring to any things that exist, right? So that's just an example. There you go, right there. Of you talking. So it's not the case that every time you talk about something. Well, I mean,
Okay. I was just mistaken in what I was thinking. I was thinking that it's always explained in terms of things that exist, but that wasn't the point. I guess I missed it.
It's like I think Xbox's point was that if Ozzy refers to Quatlu, which he loves to do, and doesn't actually point to anything that like, if he then like strings together a bunch of words that I've never heard before, and he doesn't know what they mean either, it's not going to really describe the thing, right?
Right.
But that's it's kind of it's a little different than what Alex was saying in terms of a non-existent thing which has properties that we're positing, like what this thing would be, right? We're saying that a unicorn is, always a white horse that doesn't care for hay, that has a one horn and
why? Where'd you get that?
I did totally miss that, because I thought you were saying that the properties would refer to something that doesn't exist, and I couldn't think of anything of a property that I could apply to something that wasn't referred to something that exists. I got you though.
But the interesting thing though is that we do like my example with Santa Claus, right? Is you have expectations for what Santa Claus would be, where you stumble over it, right?
Right.
But it doesn't exist, so it's kind of a weird thing that you have expectations or properties. So. Yeah,
like I could say my sister, and I don't have a sister. So when I say my sister, it's quite clear what that means, right? Everyone knows what sister means, and my, it's very easy to see them using it to mean in relation to me, my sister. So the meaning of it's clear, but so this is all the differences between sense and references. There's obviously a sense present there, but there isn't a referent, because there isn't a thing that answers to the description my sister, right? So when we're talking about things that don't exist, we're using properties, which I guess the properties exist for us to be able to use them, but there isn't anything that answers to those properties. So in the case of my sister, there isn't anything that's like that. And or the case of the unicorn, yeah, sure, there are horses and there are things with horns, but there's nothing which is both a horse and a thing with a horn, right? So nothing falls into that description. Okay, and names can do it as well, like Santa Claus, I guess, is a proper name. His surname is Claus or something, right? So there isn't really a description there. There's just a name, and normally all names do is point to things their reference. So there's something kind of strange about the idea that, like, well, Santa Claus, wears a red cape or whatever. He delivers presents at Christmas. Well, those things are true, at least intuitively, but also there isn't anything that refers to, or Pegasus has a horn, right? That's kind of true, but even though Pegasus doesn't exist, so it's weird. There's this thing, there isn't really a thing there, but I'm still saying in a sense that there is a thing there and it has this additional property. So what's going on with that? Right? There's something odd, that this basic idea that what it means to utter a proposition which is true is that you're saying of a thing that it has a property, which seems very intuitive. That sort of core semantic idea, there must be something wrong with it, because it doesn't account for how you can say Pegasus doesn't exist. In fact, that makes that a contradiction, which is bizarre because it just seems to be uncontroversially true. And when you want to say something about Father Christmas or Santa Claus, even though there isn't anything answering to that name, it still seems true to be able to predicate things about it. So there's two problems there that this traditional theory can't give you an answer to. So Russell makes a stab at coming up with an answer to this because he's not very impressed with Frege's answer, or at least he starts off being, and in fact he starts off taking a view that's more radical than Frege's in what he later regards as the wrong direction, which is similar to this guy Alexis Meinong. So you wanted to touch on Meinong as well, is that right, Bert?
Well, only in the sense of we haven't touched on what this does to ontologies and how whether things are real or not, right? And it seemed like Russell initially took that view, but it sounds like he later, and they're not sure why, but later stepped away from that and went for a much more efficient ontology.
Yeah,
but you were talking about. I think it's useful to talk about Russell's that notion of existence. That when you're talking about these things, that implied is existence for the King of France. When you talk about the King of France as bald, or these entities, that's part of the truth making quality, right? That would need to exist.
Yeah, that's right. So there is something obviously to it that, like, when you're talking about something and what you're saying is true, then in some sense or another, it does seem to indicate that what you're talking about exists. There is a thing there in some sense for you to be able to refer to it and say something about it. So Meinong is this much maligned figure. He's the punch bag of philosophy, because everyone has to read On Denoting by Russell, and in there Russell spends quite a lot of time picking on Meinong, and really what he's doing is picking on his own self. So On Denoting is this paper written in 1905, and in 1903 he wrote this book called The Principles of Mathematics, and in that he advocates this Meinongian view. So really he's picking on himself, but doesn't say that in the paper. It's
just 2 years later. Wow.
Yeah, I know, he completely changed his mind. And Russell changed his mind. He was, that's the characteristic thing about Russell, is that he changes his mind. There's almost no philosophical concept that he puts forward that he doesn't 6 months later abandon and says that that's wrong, apart from the theory of descriptions, which he stuck to right until, I think he writes a paper in response to Peter Strawson in like 1953 or something, where he's properly old by this point. And even at that point, he's saying, no, you've got it all wrong. Theory of descriptions is still right. You're wrong about it. And so he doesn't say, oh, I've changed my mind, like he did with everything else. He stuck to it. And it's in 1905 where he explains this change of heart that he's had. So Meinong's view, according to Russell, is that when you talk about, so there's basically that there's two types of existence. Right? There's the existence that when you say, this bit of pizza exists or whatever, that exists. And when you talk about things like numbers or fictional entities, possibly religious figures or whatever, when we can talk about them, but they don't really exist. They subsist. So he just makes up a new category of existence. So it's kind of like secondary existence. It's a bit like the way, for a Platonist, abstract objects exist, but kind of in a Platonic heaven, so sort of somewhere else in a slightly different way or something. So there's this division between being, right? There's existing and subsisting. Now,
can you and just to clarify, that doesn't mean that they're not saying that these things are actual, right?
Yeah, they are. Yeah, they are saying that they're actual.
Would you explain? I've talked about subsistence before. A lot of people have had issue. Would you explain subsistence briefly?
Yeah, it definitely do, because I don't see the difference between. It seems like that he's just adding a word that he's calling being. I don't get what he's getting at.
Well, so what Meinong, the actual guy Meinong, is doing is slightly misrepresented by Russell here. So I think it's only fair to say that what Meinong's up to explicitly is trying to characterize objects of thought. So he's not so much interested in whether or not they like existence independently of me thinking about them. It's not really the thing that he's interested in. So he's quite happy. So in that context, it makes a lot more sense to say something like phenomenologically, I refer to things like pizza slices, and I also refer to things like Father Christmas. So that I obviously have two distinct categories of things that I refer to. And so from my point of view, I treat them both as if they exist. And from my point of view, I know I can I rely on certain things like pizza to sustain me. I know that it's there, and I don't step out into traffic because I know it's real and stuff like this. Whereas with Father Christmas, it doesn't really matter with some fictional bad guy in a film or something, I can refer to him. The Joker, oh, he's so tricky, isn't he? Bloody Joker, whatever. But I'm not actually worried about him. So I can refer to him and I can entertain his existence in a certain way, but I don't have to worry about him because I know he's not real. So from my point of view, I make a distinction between these two things. So psychologically, there's a distinction, and that's really what Meinong's about. That's what his project is about. He's not just this idiot who said this really stupid ontological division. So this is the thing, most people read on Denoting and they read a bunch of other Russell stuff, and then no one ever reads Meinong. And I delved into it a little bit just to see what the guy was talking about, and he's actually much better than Russell makes him out to be. But anyway, on the other hand, Russell, before this, really does take this view that anything you can refer to exists in some sense or another. So there has to be literally two types of being. And it's just a consequence of, he thinks, the theory that seems so obvious, which is that when this kind of Aristotelian principle, if you're going to say something true, there has to be something about which you're saying it. And so if it's not a concrete, existing thing, because the Aristotelian principle seems so intuitive, there must be some kind of other type of existence there. That's basically the line of thought that gets to it. He's not entirely plucked it out of nowhere, but it's dubious, and I mean he doesn't like it himself after a few years, probably less. So what he ends up coming down to saying is, screw that, basically. The two types of... So his problem with it is really this, that if you have two types of being, then... so take the round square, for example. There is a round square because you can refer to it. So in some sense it subsists, at least, so it's there. But then that means because it's round and because it's square, and round things are not square and square things are not round, then it's a contradictory object, right? It's both round and not round at the same time. And that's, from Russell's point of view, bad enough to discredit the whole theory. And he basically says, when I thought that through properly and realized that really the law of non-contradiction has to go, I said goodbye to that idea. So I'm coming up with a new theory now which doesn't infringe on the law of non-contradiction. And that's his theory of descriptions.
How does Meinong cope with when you talk about the round square? You have properties that you're putting forward that are contradictory, such that you can't even hold the concept, right? I don't know, it's a meaningless utterance, right? The round square.
Is that when he brings up absisting?
Absisting.
Mm-hmm.
I absisted all the way through college, but that's as far as I could get.
That's something like a round square.
Is that right?
That's what my wife said.
That's what I heard. I heard he actually has three categories, right?
Is that right?
Exist, subsist, and absist, and the round square fits in the absisting part.
Okay, contradictory objects then fit
Right.
into that category. Is that the idea? Okay, great. Okay, good. But then still, from his point of view, he's not really doing formal semantics. I mean, he's trying to classify objects of thought, so it's psychological.
That's right. It seems to me to be wholly psychological.
Yeah,
right?
He's quite explicit about that. Whereas Russell's not doing a psychological. So this is another thing about Frege as well. His influence on logic and the semantics of logic is he was an anti-psychologist. So psychologism is the theory that logical relations are relations of thought. So the reason or what we're doing when we pick out logical laws or something is we're picking out laws of the way that our minds have to work. And Frege thought that when we were picking out logical laws or whatever, making inferences, we're talking about real, though abstract, objects, not the contents of our own minds or whatever. So he has various arguments against this. And Russell is also known for a kind of realism in the face of idealism, and suggesting that, like I said before, these kind of idealists were thinking like all there is like spirit, and he's saying no, screw that. There's like actual stuff in the world, and for these semantic reasons, it seems that it has to be there, and we have to be able to refer to it in order for us to have the possibility of communicating at all. So this is like we've got like linguistic or logical arguments towards a conclusion that there seem to be decent kind of philosophical arguments in the previous generations or whatever that suggested that you can't ever get beyond your perceptions and talk about the world or something. This kind of traditional Kantian or solipsistic kind of worry that leads you to say, well, there must be just nothing but mind out there. They're saying that considerations of the basic forms of language. So this is kind of the essence of the linguistic turn. Is that like from thinking about the way that language functions and what it must be made like to be possible, that means that we must be able to refer to things in the world. There must be things in the world, and so it's kind of got this realism built into it. And that's one of the attractive things about it, I think. Sorry, I just rambled for a bit there.
That's fine. Did we want to move into how Russell then saw himself resolving that or dealing with that, at least till Strawson?
Oh.
Yeah, okay, I'll be happy to. Let me just grab a beer from here.
Does anybody else have any thoughts they want to offer? Helen, you must have a whole sheet of questions. You're so prepared usually.
Are you calling me out?
Yeah.
Well, no. I'll hang back and wait till we get into.
No, that's what
I figured when you said that you weren't quite prepared for this, that meant you only had 9 pages of notes rather than the usual 20.
I'm prepared. I'm just not.
All of these notes are just in my head, so hopefully they pop out, right? But so I don't know what I like about this is going to skip a lot of stuff, right? But it's still, what I like about the descriptions is that it kind of accounts for when we're in this position where we want to talk about something but we don't have a name for it, right? And the thing we want to talk about isn't a thing that we can really point to. We can still do it because we can just substitute the little descriptions for the names since we don't have a name. And that comes up a lot in my line of work. The other thing I like is I try to hold on to Strawson and that kind of thing when I'm trying to do. Well, you know what? If I bring it up, it will take us way. Let's
go back to
the descriptions.
Yeah, let's have Alex talk about descriptions, and maybe we'll wrap up with the getting into some of those later theories.
Okay, so the idea is that Russell comes along and says something like, so the previous paradigm has a sentence having this subject-object form, right? There's the thing you're referring to and what you're saying about it. So you say, Alex has a beard. I'm the referent of the sentence, and what you're saying about that referent is that it has the property of being bearded or something, right? And that sentence is true if the thing that you're talking about has the property that you're ascribing to it. And this runs into the problem, like we said before, about saying, because that seems very intuitive, obviously, but the problem is that if you want to say something like, well, Pegasus doesn't exist, and you try and apply that model, then you're saying, okay, so here's this thing, this is the thing we're talking about, and I'm applying this property, but unlike having a beard or whatever, any other type of normal property like that, I'm ascribing this property to it, which is that there isn't a thing. And so that's kind of undermined the success of the reference in the first place. So the success of the reference and the success of the predication are kind of incompatible with each other. But you need both of them in order to say something true.
can I bring up a good example that that helped me a lot was the example that I think again it's Kane B has all these great examples. I think one of them, or no, I think he actually got this one from someone else. It's the sad man drinking whiskey in the corner.
Yeah, martini.
Drinking a martini, but if it turns out to be water, it turns out that he's drinking water. Was it true that there was a sad man drinking in the corner, or it's true in a sense, right?
I think we want it to turn out to be true, right? But if there's water instead of a martini, it seems like we're kind of forced to say it was false, but we don't want to do that because in fact there is something true about the fact that that particular guy is sad.
Well, you're describing certain things that are true, but not all of them, right?
But so what we're doing, so we've jumped ahead a bit because now what we're talking about is a problem for the theory of descriptions. So
so let's start with defining the theory of descriptions, and then maybe we can get into that problem.
Yeah. Okay, good. So so Russell's idea is that instead of the form of the sentence, so I mean, if I want to say something, Alex is bearded, and I want to say something like the guy who's now talking in this Google Hangout is bearded, then the description that I gave in the second example, on the face of it seems like it has the same function as the name that I used in the first example, right? Alex and the guy who's now talking. It seemed like they both have the same, all they do is point to me. But Russell says the logical form of these two, even though they seem like they're the same, the logical form of these is actually different to each other. So this is important because it's marking the beginnings of the kind of attempt at showing logical form of things and thereby kind of dispelling otherwise unseen ambiguities that might lurk beneath the sort of surface structure of natural language. So we're distinguishing two levels, right? There's the way we normally say things in normal language, that's quite messy and imprecise. And then there's the logical form which kind of sits underneath it, which is, you know, the way that language actually functions. And Russell's saying that these two things which look similar on the surface, when you scratch beneath the surface and look at their logical form, they have a different structure. And the structure of a description is actually a lot more complicated than the structure of a name that just stands in for something. So instead of it just being like Alex and the property of being bearded kind of glued together in this sentence structure, the logical form, the logical form, he actually borrows an idea from Frege in Frege's attempt to reduce mathematics to logic, which I talked about before. So in that, he gives definitions for natural numbers. So you can talk about the number one, say, if I want to say something like, there's exactly one piece of pizza, what you do is you say something like this, that, let's see exactly how does it go, something like, there is a thing such that it has so there is this thing X, let's say, such that it has the property of being a piece of pizza. And for everything else, like everything else, if it has the property of being a piece of pizza, then it's the same thing as X. Right? So there's only one thing which is a piece of pizza. There's at least one thing which is a piece of pizza, and there's at most one thing which is a piece of pizza. So there's only one thing. So in that, he's achieved a reference to a single individual thing. And then to refer to two things, you can just slap on a little bit extra to that. So you say, if I want to say there's exactly two pieces of pizza here, I say there's this thing which is a piece of pizza, and for everything else, it's either, for everything else, if it's a piece of pizza, it's either this thing or it's this other thing. Right, and that's saying that there's at least one thing which is a piece of pizza, and there's at most two things which is, oh fuck, I think I just mangled the definition of two. Forget the definition of two, I should have brushed up more words before.
Like two things that would refer to.
Yeah, I suppose it's saying that there is this thing X and this thing Y. Yeah, that's it. Okay, so there's this thing X and there's this thing Y. X is a piece of pizza, Y is a piece of pizza, and for any Z, if it's a piece of pizza, either it's identical to X or it's identical to Y. Right. And that's telling you that there's at least two things which are pieces of pizza, and there's at most two things. There isn't three things. Right, so in that fashion, he can define all of the natural numbers in the following way. But Russell picks up on this definition of one where what you're doing is you're using quantifiers. You're saying there's at least one thing, there's at most one thing, and you kind of like triangulate on there being exactly one thing. And
yeah, I've always looked at it as, or at least referred to it as singles, right? Like we just categorize anything beyond a single. So you have 3, it would be 3 singles. It's just a way of shortening and categorizing those singles as 3.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense, kind of.
Yeah.
At least that's how I've always kind of viewed it. I don't make like, what's the biggest criticism of these of this kind of view on language?
On the view of descriptions, or
yeah.
Well, I suppose the Donnellan example and the Strawson example. So what we're talking about here is the idea of phrases that start with the word the, right? Like the King of France or the piece of pizza or something like this is called definite descriptions, because the word the indicates that there's only one thing. So if I say some bit of pizza, as far as Russell's concerned, I'm not necessarily talking about one piece of pizza.
Right.
Okay, so if I say I had a piece of pizza, you go, yeah, you had 3 pieces of pizza. I'll go, yeah, well, it's still true that I had a piece of pizza. And so in that sense, having a piece of pizza doesn't mean you only had one, right? It means I had at least one piece of pizza. I had a piece of pizza. If I had the piece of pizza, that does indicate that I only had one piece, the piece, right? So there's some kind of singular existence that's indicated by the word the. So Russell's at the moment sketching out a theory of these types of sentences, just these ones, the ones that have the word the in it. And he's arguing...
That includes proper names for Russell?
Not to begin with. Only in the last paragraph of On Denoting does he stick that in. Up until that point, he's arguing for a theory of descriptions, which is simply just that phrases that in natural language have the such and such. The logical form of them is like the way that Frege defines number 1. So the piece of pizza is there is at least one thing which is a piece of pizza and at most one thing which is a piece of pizza. And in that, there is no singular term, no name. Like, so the idea is that a name like Alex, the logical form of that could simply just be a term that just picks me out. If you say the bearded philosophy guy that's talking now, then in Russell's analysis, that doesn't involve a singular term like the name did. So he's taking the idea that those two things would be syntactically similar. He's saying no, they're not syntactically similar at all. One of them has a singular term in it, and the other one doesn't have anywhere a singular term. We achieve the reference via this kind of trick using quantifiers, saying at least one thing and at most one thing, and that gets us there. It kind of triangulates down onto one thing and achieves the reference, whereas the singular term just kind of jumps straight to the thing that it's referring to. Yeah. Well, the benefit of this descriptions theory is that when you're talking about something that doesn't exist, then the first claim, which was there is at least one thing which is present King of France or something, that's false. So if I say there is, so with Russell's idea is that if you analyze out the sentence, the present King of France is bald. Now, this would be one of these troubling sentences if descriptions were singular terms and singular terms worked in the way that we talked before about presupposing that there's something that exists. So if we say, well, hold on a minute, so the description, the present King of France, isn't a name, so it works as a definite description, and it says that there is at least one thing which is present King of France, and that's false. So if we say the present King of France is bald, that's false because there is no present King of France. Right. If we say the present King of France is not bald, well, that's also false because there's no present King of France.
That's why I was asking you if that's not just malformed. I mean, is that not just me saying, tree door pizza purple? Or like...
No, it's not malformed. It's perfectly sensible, but it's just false. It's false that... So if you say it out loud, if you say, there is at least one thing which is the present King of France, and there's at most one thing which is the present King of France, and that thing is bald, right? That's false, not because it's attributing baldness to this object is wrong, but saying that there is an object in the first place is wrong.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Like, you're saying the present King of France, you might as well say unicorn, kind of.
No, it's not like saying unicorn.
That's what I'm trying to figure out. I'm sort of misunderstanding.
He would say it's meaningful, right?
It's
meaningful. If there is no King of France,
it's still meaningful.
Referring to?
But it's but it's a meaningful statement, which I think is Russell's. Russell didn't want to say that those weren't meaningful utterances, right?
Yeah, right.
Oh, like the one saying that the unicorn doesn't exist. That one would be not meaningful, or there.
Well, it depends. So in mythology, there is. So if you take Pegasus, for instance, Pegasus actually apparently isn't a name, even in ancient mythology. It's the Pegasus. It's supposed to refer in a singular term, definite description, way, to pick out something that's described by its properties of having flying and having a horn or whatever being this magical, the Pegasus. So in that sense, it's a description. It's supposed to be a description, and Russell's analysis says that it's meaningful to talk about it, but you can't say anything true about it, because anything you say about it is explicitly or implicitly, but explicitly when you look at the logical form, saying that it exists, and that's false.
Right. Okay.
So if you say, unicorn's great, love the unicorn or whatever, it's a great thing, that's false. Okay, so the unicorn's this really crummy thing that's really rubbish, and that's false as well. Both of those attributions are false because there is no thing you're talking about.
Right. So they might as well be hypothetical. It's a thought experiment, kind of just.
Yeah, right.
No matter what conclusion you come to with it, it's still going to end up being false.
That's right. Well, saying anything, a simple attribution of a property to it's going to be false anyway. Yeah. So I mean, you can stick it in other contexts. It gets kind of more complicated. But if you want to say something like, I believe that the unicorn's cool or something, that's up to you. It might be true that you believe that, even though there isn't a thing there.
Right.
So there are certain contexts in which you can say true things and use the term. But the point is that if you're just saying a simple, straightforward, like it's got a horn or something, that's false according to Russell. Just like saying present King of France is bald is false.
I'm following now. Thank you.
Yeah, what he thought was the most significant part of this. Or maybe it's that later on he decided it in hindsight, but one of the kind of major innovations that's really important for the history of philosophy that comes out of Russell's paper here is that because the logical form of the description is more complicated than it would be if it was just a name, it allows you more. It allows you to be able to negate it in various different ways. So, for instance, this is quite hard to do without seeing it written down, but you can imagine that the logical form, if the present King of France is bald, if the logical form was just like name and property, then it's all you can do is negate that. It's either that the name and the property go together, or it's not the case that the name and the property go together. And that's it. So it's either true that the King of France is bald, or it's false that the King of France is bald, right? One or the other. And with Russell's logical analysis, there's loads of different parts going on. Or at least there's 3 different parts. There's the claim. There's at least one thing which is the present King of France. There's at least one thing which is the present King of France. Second bit, there is at most one thing which is the present King of France. Third bit, that thing is bald. Right. So I could stick a negation in front of any of these independent bits, and it gives me a slightly different sentence. So if I stick a negation in front of the whole thing, I'm saying it's not the case that there is a thing, at most one thing, and that thing is bald. Right? All of that, I'm just saying it's not the case that all 3 of those hold. But I could say, stick the negation just in front of the baldness bit. And then in that sense, what I would be doing is I'm saying there is a thing, which is present King of France, and there is only one thing, which is present King of France, but he's not bald. So that would imply that he has hair. So I can negate it in 2 different ways, at least 2 different ways. And Russell describes it as a wide scope negation or narrow scope negation. So the wide scope negation negates the whole sentence, and the narrow scope just negates the fact that the predicate holds of the thing that I referred to with the description. Right, saying is there is a thing, that there is a king, but he's not bald. So imagine overnight they've re-established the monarchy in France. So when I say present King of France is bald, that might be false because there is a present king there and he just has hair, say. Maybe Bert's been elected president and King of France or something, and because Bert's got hair, then what I said is false, right? So this scope distinction is like a kind of a way of using logical form to distinguish between 2 kind of otherwise unnoticed ways of spelling out something that might be going on. So when someone says, "Oh no, it can't be the case that the present king," well, it must be one of those two is true or something. The other guy goes, "No, they can both be false." Right? How do you sort out which one of these two people is right here? Well, one way of thinking about it is you'd have to give a rigorous analysis of what the terms mean that you're using, both parties agreed on, so that then you could use that analysis to come to an objective conclusion as to whether or not they're both true or one's true and the other's false. And Russell thinks that, well, if you agree with his analysis, it gives you a determinate answer, and the answer is that they're both false. So that's the theory of descriptions. Obviously, I could keep talking about that for quite a long time, but
that was along those lines. That was where how I ended up describing nothing in that video was the set of no things, essentially. You take the set of all things and then you predicate none of them, right?
Right. So yes, okay. So if you want to say something like nothing is I don't know, some made-up property like splurb or something, right? That nothing is splurb. The way you could think about it, this kind of Russellian way would be you say something like, if you want to say the splurb thing, because that property doesn't apply to anything that you've just made up. It's like you go through all of the things in the universe and put them into one of two piles. This is kind of how Russell describes it. You put them into the things that are splurb and the things that are not splurb. And if you find that everything that there is goes in the not splurb file, then that's what you mean to say there is nothing which is splurb. You're not positing a thing, a nothing, whatever the hell that is.
Right.
You're saying of this mysterious entity that I can't really describe to you properly, that's the thing, and it both exists because it's the thing that I'm referring to, and it doesn't exist because it's a nothing or whatever. You don't get stuck in this problem. It's called Plato's beard, this problem, because it goes back to most things. Platonic dialogue where I can't remember which one it is, but one of them says something like what does he say? Something like, and the good or whatever. And what we should say about the good is that it's indescribable or something. And then they come back and he says, but do you not see the problem? Earlier on, I said to you that the good is indescribable, and there I described it as indescribable. And that's kind of, so we're getting stuck into this problem of like, how do I say that there's a thing that doesn't exist, or there is and isn't a thing, or if this thing is nothing, do I have to have a thing that's nothing in order to say that this is nothing? And so we eliminate all those problems by just simply saying, put everything into one of two piles. If all the things go in this pile, that's what it means for the other pile to be nothing, that there's nothing there or something. So I think that's a perfectly straightforward. There aren't any philosophical problems with that. That's the most intuitive thing about the theory of descriptions and why I think it's a good theory, basically.
Yeah. So you have, it seems like that borders on the self-referential sets, right? Where the truth paradox or whatever, the statement is false. When you get into denoting difference, like a set being the member of itself, or
right.
It seems like Plato's beard kind of is dealing with those types of issues related to sets and members and self-referencing. But
yeah, so the set of sets that aren't members of themselves is a paradox called Russell's paradox, that Russell figured out that Frege's logicist program wasn't going to work because the theory of sets that Frege had assumed, or in more particular the fifth axiom of his theory, had this funny problem with it, which was that it allows sets of any. It basically just allows sets of any description. So yeah, you can say you can construct these self-referential. So not all sets that are self-referential are problematic, but there are particular cases that are. It's a very interesting area, but it's very it's kind of tangential to what we're talking about. But basically, right. Yeah, he pointed out like on your theory, you can't rule out the idea that there's a set of all sets that that aren't members of themselves, right. But the set of all sets, if it So it's let's work it through then. It's the set of all sets of all sets that aren't members of themselves. If it is a member of itself, then it doesn't have the property of not being a member of itself. If it isn't a member of itself, then it does have the property of not being a member of itself. So either way around, you get into this problem. So it's a kind of contradiction. And it's supposed to be that Frege is literally at the printing press with his book when he receives this letter from Russell saying to him, I just noticed that the whole thing completely collapses like a house of cards. So, what do you reckon? And he's like, shit, it's too late.
Yeah, I have a letter included at the end of my video on nothing. It's called like nothing between the Trey Dradlow, nothing between the ears or something like that. And and it's this wonderful letter where Russell talks about Frege abandoning that it was his life's work, and that he recognized it and he wrote the most gracious of letters and walked away from it completely. And with all the other terrible things that you hear about Frege, it was nice to see Russell saying that it was the highest he had ever seen. It was the greatest expression he had ever seen in a man. Right? That he pays him this giant compliment of having been faced with something that was wrong, and rather than trying to salvage it or save face or do something, he was so interested in the truth that he walked away from it. But it was a really nice thing to read anyway. So moving on. So in terms of problems with the description theory, then theory of descriptions.
Oh, okay. So I mean, let's just very quickly say something about the very last bit of the idea. Is that so? This is a theory about how phrases that begin with the word the work, right? But Russell also seems to, he just sort of became so enamored with this very, very quickly that he ended up proposing that actually maybe what we think of as names, like Bert and Alex and stuff like this, that they're actually descriptions as well when you scratch beneath the surface. And so when you say Alex, what you really mean is, that guy, kind of bearded philosophy guy or whatever. And that's how you refer to him, especially if you've never met the person or met the thing that you're talking about. So if I want to say something like, Socrates, I never met Socrates, right? I've never actually come across him. So to talk about him, isn't it quite plausible that what I'm really doing is, talking about, that old Greek philosopher guy, the kind of teacher of Plato and the subject of his dialogues or something? Like, that's what I mean when I say Socrates. It seems like there's this sort of intuitive pull there. And that allowed Russell to say, he says something like, look, when we give a name for a thing, what we really mean is the things that we are directly acquainted with. So if I've seen something directly with my own eyes, I can name it and talk about that thing and refer to it. So that's kind of knowledge by acquaintance. But everything else when I'm talking about it. So if I've actually met Bert, I can say, oh, Bert, because I'm like thinking back to that time when I met him. That's what I mean by Bert. If I haven't met Bert, I have to like come up with some description that fits him uniquely, and that's the only way I can do it. So he thinks there's knowledge by acquaintance and knowledge by description.
He sees those as two different things. It's really interesting.
It's an epistemological distinction, and he thinks it's mirrored in, and then that's a reason why you should accept this semantic idea that most names are actually disguised descriptions. So there's this, on the one hand, there's a theory of descriptions for definite description terms, terms that begin with the word the, and then there's this idea that descriptions are the right way of characterizing what look like names, actual proper names from normal language. And you don't necessarily have to take both those on. Like I was saying before we started, I'm more inclined to think that the theory of descriptions is a good theory of descriptions than a good theory of names. But Russell certainly goes there, right?
Is there any, just as a side note, has there been any, is there any neurological support to that, or any scientific, in terms of how we categorize and how we perceive individuals or perceive events, things that come directly through perception versus building from existing concepts. Like when I build Socrates, I have an experience of Socrates through Plato's dialogues, but I have a concept of him formed from who knows what, right? A mishmash. But that's very different than direct perception of my microphone here or other things.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a good question actually, and I don't know if there has been any. I don't know how you would test the theory, but I don't know if anyone has done. But they probably have because it's.
It'd have to be a qualitative difference in terms of how you access. Like there's I know there's different. I bring this up periodically, but there's differences in terms of how you perceive your parents versus strangers or things like that, and it has to do with emotions that are tied to them through the amygdala and whatnot, and those memories have a different way of being processed than things that are familiar versus not, and so I didn't know if there was some type of qualitative difference between how we experience our thoughts of Socrates versus other things based on the way they were perceived or the way that came about. But anyway, it's interesting.
Yeah, and in a way, I'm not sure whether even if that was true, whether or not there's some sense in which, because this is a theory about meaning, right. It might be that we can. So it might be that we can all think about our own sort of idiosyncratic things when we're talking about things. But when these people are saying, this is how the word refers, it's sort of doing that independently of how you think about it. So
right.
Even if you don't know anything about Socrates. It is finding him, if it's successfully referring to him via some description, even if you don't know what that is. I mean, that might be some kind of plausible way of rendering. It's just, I suppose Russell's idea is that independently of you, like objectively, there's this logical substructure to language, and we discover it through analysis. I mean, it's an old-fashioned idea in a sense because it's 1905. But it's also super high-tech and modern in another way because it's like the idea of it anyway is that you can discover this kind of logically ideal landscape or something, structure that just lies slightly out of view. That's the sort of thing that a computer could understand and get into. And if we could, I suppose there's this dream, this kind of Leibnizian dream that you could come up with a perfect language suitable for scientific inquiry into the nature of things, which would be free from ambiguity. And if we could find that way of talking, doing philosophy, finding out, engaging with the world, then we would kind of be on the right track. It's this kind of holy grail of for some mathematically inclined philosophers, that's a kind of holy grail of how we should eliminate these, whatever, Jadlodian kind of ambiguities that might be abounding otherwise, right? We can get
I
out
love
of
that.
We're driving all of the pragmatists and the anti-realists nuts right now, talking about this.
But that was a dream anyway. And I don't know. Maybe it's a more old-fashioned these days than it was at the time. I mean, when Russell's paper came out, apparently he had to go to London or wherever the headquarters were of the publishing house to tell them you've got to publish this, and they didn't understand it. But almost no one outside, maybe Moore and his immediate circle would have known about it, but almost no one else understood it.
It was being published in Mind, and they were like, "We can't publish this," and he had to go down and actually insist on them doing so.
We can't publish this. Is that a real story, or is that a legend?
Well, it's one of Russell's stories, so it's difficult to know. It's filled with great stories. One of these people that seems to get... He's supposed to have survived a plane crash because he sat at the back of the plane in the smoking area.
Oh, please.
Right, just so he could smoke a pipe whilst he was doing it, and then it got into turbulence, and the front half of the plane got ripped off in the crash, and he would have died. Apparently so. It's one of these people that,
Amazing.
I caught a fish this big.
If I can frame this idea, okay, so that you can then knock it down and see if I frame it well enough, right? This idea that proper names really are just sort of abbreviated, definite descriptions. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to give my little Silverman experience, and then you can explain it better, right? So I think that there could be something intuitively right about the idea that proper names aren't. There's nothing special about a proper name. It's really just an abbreviated, definite description. And my little personal experience is, and a plug at the same time. Tomorrow we're going to have David Silverman on my show. When I was trying to, recruit and find out who was interested and who wasn't interested, there were these. I kind of made up two classes of types of people. That's right. And so one class were real activists, if you will, real with a capital R, who weren't really into the whole YouTube G+ thing. And they knew David Silverman. If they couldn't quite remember, I was like, David Silverman, are you interested? They'd be like, wait a second, who is that again? I could say President of American Atheists, and it would click for them. And they would go, and suddenly the referent, David Silverman, the guy, would pop into their heads and they would know what I was talking about. The other class of people were not real activists. They were YouTubers, right? YouTube types, G+ types. Even if they had hard atheist opinions, they wouldn't know who David Silverman was. And if I said President of American Atheists, it wouldn't help them. But for those people, when they were like, wait, who's that again? If I went, oh, that's the tides go in meme guy, it would click for them, right? And then they would then hook into the referent David Silverman, the guy. So that to me is sort of anecdotal support for this idea that names really are kind of just abbreviated definite descriptions. And so before we went on the air, you were like, yeah, but there's actually a causal theory, and you, Alex, prefer it. So as an introduction, maybe you could kind of talk about that.
Okay, yeah, so that isn't... So I wouldn't say that was an example that supports the idea that names are, in fact, definite descriptions in disguise, because what it's doing, really, is saying that often when somebody doesn't know the referent of a name, it's easy. So if they're not already acquainted with the person, so if you're the next door neighbor of Dave Silverman, you're probably going to have met him a couple of times. You say Dave Silverman to that guy, and he's going to go, oh, yeah, and he's going to think in his head, oh yeah, the guy, I saw him earlier. That's that guy.
The guy who borrowed my lawnmower.
Yeah, well, yeah. So you don't want to turn it into a description like the guy who borrowed my lawnmower, but it's more like you can, in an ideal sense, you can go, oh, that guy, right? Point at him, that guy over there, this guy here, whatever, something like that. Where you can do what they call an ostensive definition. That's where you're saying this guy, that guy, right? At least when you're acquainted with someone.
Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so when you're acquainted with someone, that gives you the opportunity to say that guy, right? When you're there, he's there in front of you, right? And so from that point onwards, you can always remember yourself thinking that guy, right? And that's how you can refer to him directly. And obviously, if you haven't met him before, you need to, or I suppose it's kind of a grey area. I mean, does seeing someone on TV allow you to say that guy? Maybe it does, right? So maybe you've seen
Might be able to say it after I've had my hangout.
Yes, I think hangout counts as meeting. Who knows whether Russell would have agreed or not? But I'm sure Russell wouldn't have had anything to do with Google Hangouts if he was still around.
But TV would, if the Google Hangout counts, the TV would. It would just. He wouldn't be able to refer to me as that guy, but I could refer to him as that guy.
But anyway, let's get back to the thing.
So you've managed to come up with various properties, unique properties that he has, and he's better known for having those properties. So, like the President of American Atheists, the tides goes in guy, right? And you were able to, in fact, not use his name, but use those instead. The theory of the theory that names are definite descriptions is harder to test, because what it's saying is that, well, say you said Dave Silverman to someone, and they go, oh yeah, I know Dave Silverman. The idea is that they've got a definite description that they use to pick out Dave Silverman. Or if they say something of Dave Silverman is a funny guy or something, right? And say that sentence is true. And the reason that sentence is true is because the thing that's picked out by the definite description that they use has the property of being funny or funny guy, right? That's what makes it true. So it's a semantic theory, right? It's not really a theory about
But does it not start out the same way as the others, referring to something that may not, like if I refer to you like Alex, I'm referring to all of the unique combination of your properties. But I'm not. There's nothing that I'm actually pointing at other than that unique combination of properties.
Yeah, and Russell's theory has built within it the idea that you say there's at least one thing with this property, and at most one thing with that property, right? And that's the bearded guy, whatever. So that if you're using a description, you are claiming explicitly that this thing exists. So if it doesn't exist, then whatever you're saying afterwards is false, because the first thing you've said explicit. So a description carries within it explicitly the idea, the claim that the thing that you're referring to exists.
But I'm not referring to like if I refer to Alex, Alex itself is not a thing that exists. Unless when I say Alex, I am just shorthanding this unique combination of properties. The bearded guy that talks philosophy, you know what I mean? Do you not, like when I say like when you say Nick to me, you're not referring to a thing called Nick. You're referring to all the unique qualities that make Nick.
Well, I mean that's Russell's. Well, the claim anyway is that that's what you're doing when you have to. Like Russell doesn't think that you'd do this if you had a direct way of referring to them instead. So where you can use a name as a name, go ahead and use a name as a name. It's much easier. But where you're in a position where you don't know, haven't had knowledge by acquaintance, so Socrates or Hitler or whatever, those are people we want to be able to refer to, but don't know them, haven't had any direct acquaintance with them. The only way we can do it is, according to Russell, by picking them out due to their unique features that they have. But to go back to, sorry.
I was just going to say, does it have to do with? It seems like it's along the lines of when you're signifying something that you're that the referent is well, I guess it's not that it's present or whatever. It's beyond that. You're saying it's acquaintance with it. So I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, like I don't think that so say someone that you know but who's now dead or something, you know, grandparent or something, you can still refer to them by a description. And that can still be true even though now there isn't a thing there anymore, because it's not quite clear. Russell's idea of existing is definitely supposed to rule out, you know, this kind of weird, funny existence, like subsistence.
Like something that did exist.
Well, I'm not so sure that it's supposed to rule out things that did exist, because at least, you know, they're no longer
I'm saying
present.
it includes it. From what you're saying, it would include things that did exist at some point.
You're talking about like Santa Claus and unicorns and Pegasus and whatnot, right?
No, we're talking about like someone that passed, like you said. Like I can refer to my grandma that died.
I meant when Alex was talking about subsistence.
Yeah, right. So you definitely want to rule out unicorns and leprechauns and stuff on the one hand, but leave. I mean, I think that Russell, he's not explicit one way or the other about this, so we have to guess, right? But given what I know about his philosophy, I think it was more likely that he'd be okay with talking about things that did exist with definite descriptions like that. So that, you know, if I say, well, I mean, I'm sure he is, in fact, because lots of the examples use Socrates as, you know, Socrates, the snub-nosed philosopher or something. And the description on Russell's terms would be, there is a thing such that it's blah, blah, blah. Well, there isn't now a thing. It depends how you read the existential quantifier in the first place, saying there is a thing now, but blah, blah, blah. Anyway, just to, because I have to go in a minute, let me just finish this thing about the Dave Silverman thing, right? So, Dave Silverman, you have referred to him with definite descriptions, and that's helpful in getting the people that you're talking to understand who it is that you mean. Okay, good. So that's not evidence that they were using, there's not evidence for the theory that names are in fact descriptions. It seems to me it's almost evidence in the other direction, because the name didn't manage to refer to them, but the definite description did, which seems to indicate that certainly the name wasn't actually the other definite descriptions that you gave and said, right, the reference of, so for the guy you talked to and you said, well, he didn't understand me when I said the president of the Atheist Society, but he did know me, or he did know him by the tides go in, tides go out meme. Well, that guy definitely didn't have Dave Silverman being synonymous with the guy who's the tides go in, tides go out guy, right? Because he didn't know the first one, but he did know the second. So that indicates that if it was a definite description, it wasn't that description anyway.
But he could have continued to talk about it if I'd never used his name. It would have signaled to him the same person, even if I had never used his name and he had never used his name.
Right.
Yeah, but so that would show you that the definite description is
the same as a name.
When the name didn't seem to succeed, the guy didn't recognize the name, the reference of the name. So the reference didn't work in his head for the name. It did work for the definite description.
It seems like one is a name and one is a title. Not just David Silverman, but like if you talk about Hitler, right? I'm not necessarily referencing the name. I'm referencing a title. Same thing with the Bob Dylan and all that as well.
I'm trying to say that actually it's just kind of arbitrary that the David Silverman is a proper name, because we could have had that conversation without me ever, like, suppose I didn't know his name or I forgot his name or something, and I could have said, you know that meme guy? He's coming on my show. Oh yeah, that meme guy. Oh wow, he's coming on that show. Come and talk to the meme guy, right? Yeah. And neither one of us would have ever had to use the proper name. So the meme guy is doing the exact same thing as the proper name.
All right. So the general idea. So the problem with that, let's say that it does count as evidence that the name David Silverman is in fact a disguised definite description. Okay, let's just say for the sake of argument that that's right. What's the objection to that view? Is the question. Like, why would you think that that's wrong? Well, Kripke made famous these objections. So the basic idea, very, very quickly, before I duck out, is that names and definite descriptions are pulled apart from one another when you think about them in modal contexts. So, for instance, if you say Dave Silverman could have been, not the president of American Atheists. He could have been born in, I don't know, Iran or something instead. Maybe his parents could have moved there when his mum was pregnant and given birth to him there, and he could have been raised, in a Muslim household and been completely devout Muslim his entire life. Right? That could have happened to Dave Silverman. Therefore, it's true that Dave Silverman might not have been the president of American Atheists. But the description, the president of American Atheists, if that was, because of that, if you say the president of American Atheists might not have been the president of American Atheists, that doesn't really make sense, because, it can't be that the guy who answers to the description, president of American Atheists, if he does answer to the description, in the other context where he might not, where you think about him not answering to that, well, it would just pick out another guy, right? Whoever was in his place. So when Dave Silverman is being raised in Iran, some other guy is president of American Atheists instead. So the definite description now picks out that other guy instead. Right? So it always picks out whoever it is that has that property. So in a sense, it's false that the president of American Atheists might not have been the president of American Atheists, because whoever is the president of American Atheists is the referent term president of American Atheists. So it's guaranteed to pick out the president of American Atheists. There's no possible world in which it doesn't do that. Right? That's all it does. But the name follows Dave Silverman around from world to world, regardless of what properties he has. Right? Because it's true that he might not have been the president of American Atheists.
Yeah, but he also might have had a different name and still the president of American Atheists. So to me, they're
equal.
They certainly seem equal. And also, I'd like to see you do that with that meme guy, because that's a lot different than the president of American Atheists, which could have anybody in its place. But that meme guy really is like a name.
Well, no, because.
I would say that the president of American...
It's more like a name. It's more like a name.
The president of American Atheists could be the same way, as a name, and referred to.
We should probably... Has anyone... how many people here have gone to university?
Me.
I did.
Okay, great.
Ever gone to school?
I've gone to school.
Yeah. Is that what you're asking? Who here has gone to school?
No, to university.
To college?
Higher education.
Higher education.
Okay.
I do have my grade 9 and a bit of other skills. But I feel like I've asked to go to the bathroom, when you go someplace, you're like, I got to go in this school and go pee real quick. and you walk into the middle of like a class, and they think you're a student, and you sit down, and they go through this whole spiel, and you sit there and smile at the professor, and that's what I've been doing for. How long's it been, boys and girls?
2 hours.
I mean, it is. I mean, it is fascinating, but I can't keep up. My modem is nowhere near what you guys are doing. Now and then, when you hear Dave Silverman, I do salivate a little bit, but the
Come
rest
to
of
my
the stuff.
show.
Yeah,
Alex,
tomorrow.
Alex, you're at
All
a
right,
different level.
We're gonna wrap this up just so we can get Alex out of here. But I did want to say thank you to Alex for bearing the brunt of that and helping us through that.
Thank you so much, Alex.
You're a very intelligent man, Alex. Really are.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alex.
When we have hangouts about computer animation, I can talk your ear off. You know.
Yeah.
But this is really helpful. I wish we could have gone a little bit longer, but we could probably go for quite a while on this, and maybe in the off air. I actually have a couple of questions for Helena, but I did want to say thanks to everyone, thanks to all of our viewers, and I'm hoping to do another big topic, and I think the next big topic I want to do is the 2 Dogmas of Empiricism by Quine.
Oh my God.
Oh, can't wait.
Which I think
That sounds interesting.
Yes,
I was going to suggest that you narrow things even more, but now you've blown it up.
I don't.
No, it's very related. It's an excellent choice for subsequent discussion.
Oh, thank you.
All the same things.
Yeah, I don't know what it is, but it sounds really interesting.
It's a work that people say that they think it's argued about as being the most important philosophical contribution from the 20th century. There's a number of those, but it's
really short. It's great.
It really takes a shot at the analytic synthetic distinctions and the and logical positivists. So it's all about scientism and other aspects. So
Yeah, great.
it's really interesting. So I'll post in the next week a kind of a primer for that, and I'd love people to join. And thank you all for showing up. If I can find my cursor here, I'll stop the broadcast. So thank you, everybody, and have a great weekend.
That was great. Thank you,
thanks
Alex.
so much.
That was really great.
Cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. Finally had the time to jump in the hangout.